Welcome to Comics Bazaar, the channel of comics commentary and arcana. This video features the Uncanny X-Men number 151, cover dated November 1981. The cover is by Dave Cockrum and Josef Rubinstein, and it features very obviously Kitty Pryde leaving the School for Gifted Youngsters, Professor X's School for Gifted Youngsters, and we have this cover caption: "The day Kitty Pryde leaves the X-Men is the day the X-Men fall." It is a cover that is not one of my favorites from the series. I think that it's reasonably well drawn, but I don't know that if I was a reader scanning the shelves and never had picked up X-Men before, that this would be the cover to make me do it. I do think also that we're into the era now of Chris Claremont very much missing that partnership with John Byrne in terms of the co-plotting, in terms of the contribution to the stories and story arcs. The X-Men doesn't really feel like there's any kind of 2-year type plan, which there was when Byrne was co-plotting with Claremont. They had worked out their plots up to 2 years down the road, and it doesn't feel like that now. It feels like Claremont is, I don't know if I'm being unfair to say floundering around, but he's casting around for sure in order to find some kind of direction. 150, the anniversary issue, was an absolutely stellar issue. This one a little less so, but really what the appeal is to the comic at this point is the relationships among the characters. And if you were perhaps like 16, 17 years old, the reason that you would stick around reading Uncanny X-Men is precisely that Claremont gets those relationships, the voices of the characters so very right. So this particular issue, Dave Cockrum, he does the cover but not the interior art. The same with the following issue. He's on a little bit of a hiatus, a little bit of a break, but he'll be back with issue 153. So the title of the story is X-Men -1, and the creative team is Chris Claremont, writer. Jim Sherman, now he's an artist that I'm not very familiar with. My research shows me that he was primarily a DC artist from the mid-70s up to about the early 80s when he hopped over to Marvel. Didn't do any straight runs on any characters at Marvel, and only does about half this particular issue before Bob McLeod takes over, and Josef Rubinstein is doing the finished art in inks throughout the issue. So there's some visual consistency throughout the issue via Rubinstein's inks. Tom Orzechowski is back as letterer on this issue, and we don't have Glynis Oliver as colorist, rather Bonnie Wilford doing the guest coloring slot. So the splash page is interesting. I think that Jim Sherman doesn't get the foreshortening right on Professor X's wheelchair here. It looks like he's got very short legs sitting in that wheelchair. Everything else about the splash page works very well with some of the X-Men in their swimsuit gear. They're obviously been sitting around the pool, and what's happened is the professor has received a letter from Chicago from Kitty Pryde's parents, and he says, "I have some bad news. Kitty's parents have decided to withdraw her from the school. They realize that Kitty likes it here, that she's doing well academically, but they believe it would be more advantageous for her to attend a school whose pupils were more her own age. She's to leave us within the week." So everybody's shocked by the news. You can see the surprise on their face. And Cyclops asks, just like that, Professor, out of the blue with no warning whatsoever. And Nightcrawler asks, can they do such a thing? So let's continue with the story. The professor says there are parents, Nightcrawler. Their actions are perfectly within their rights. I think they're making a mistake, but if their minds are made up, there's nothing we can do to prevent it. So, of course, one of the things that instantly might occur to a reader at this point, at least a reader who is familiar with the characters, is, well, are her parents being mind controlled? What's going on there? Kitty, in any case, is emotionally upset, and she leaves and goes up to her room. And the professor says to Storm, "Let her go. You two, Colossus. For the moment, I believe Kitty would rather be left alone." Now, Wolverine's got a kind of a cut the Gordian knot solution. He says, "I've got a simple solution. Charlie, why not use your telepathic powers to make the kids' folk change their minds?" And the professor is not happy with that suggestion. He says, "I may have indulged in such tactics in the past, Wolverine." He did do. And he says, though, "But no more. To deliberately manipulate a sentient mind would make me no better than the villains we oppose." And so Wolverine concludes, "So you're just going to let the kid go?" And that irks the professor. He says, "Wolverine," he snaps, We have no choice. And I like that characterization where Wolverine calls the professor Charlie, but the Professor X uses the code name. Good body language here with the disconsolate figures of Storm and Colossus, who are of course most emotionally attached to Kitty. And we see her phasing up to her bedroom, and then hours later Storm arrives to pay her a visit. I think Jim Sherman's art looks really good. You tell me what you think of his art in the comments to this video, but I think it looks great. He's got a style that is not very, I was trying to think about it, it's not influenced by Kirby, not influenced by Ditko. I see a touch of Michael Golden about his style. Yeah, and a little bit of maybe of Jim Starlin as well. Jim Starlin, Michael Golden, a kind of like a 70s type style, but it looks very good on these first few pages. And I'll point out when McLeod takes over, not as much a fan of McLeod's work as Sherman's in this issue, I will tell you that. So Storm tries to comfort Kitty and says to her, it isn't like you to sulk, but she is sulking there on the bed. And then she phases away, goes to the computer bank, and she reveals what particular school her parents are sending her to, because readers might think, especially older readers, well, what's the problem with her going to a school with children her own age? That kind of makes sense. But the particular school they're sending her to is the Massachusetts Academy, whose headmistress is Emma Frost, the White Queen of the Hellfire Club. And that recalls us back to Uncanny X-Men 129, towards the beginning of the Dark Phoenix saga, when Emma Frost tried to abduct Kitty to bring her to the Massachusetts Academy, whereas Kitty was recruited by the X-Men instead for Professor Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters. This is another great page by Jim Sherman. So we get a little callback here for readers that might not be familiar with this story. So the events of issues 129 to 131 are recalled in these panels and in Kitty's speech to Storm. Actually, no. The narrative captions are in the third person, so it's the narrator that is giving us the little catch up there. This is a nice panel here with a close-up on Storm's face. I think Jim Sherman was using photo models for some of the close-ups on faces, and Storm thinks to herself, we assumed that the White Queen had been slain during her psionic duel with Phoenix. That was in issue 131. But if she somehow survived, and so her hands are trembling, and she's thinking, after all this time, merely thinking of what happened terrifies me. I felt so vulnerable in the White Queen's hands for the first time since childhood, completely helpless. The professor will have to telepathically examine Kitty's parents to ensure they aren't acting under the Queen's influence. And of course, that makes sense. Also, Storm here has this moment with Kitty where Kitty basically complains if her parents really cared, she'd be home with them and we'd be a real family again, because Kitty's parents are splitting up. And Storm's response is, now who's being selfish? Kitten, things change, people change. What is real one day is not always real the next. That will prove ironic in terms of what happens a little later in this story when we get to the action part. And Kitty makes a good point for a 13-year-old. She says, they're my folks, Aurora. If they didn't love each other, why'd they get married? Why'd they have me? If I can't depend on that reality, what can I depend on? And that's a good point from a 13-year-old girl. And then Kitty's words spark another memory of Storm's, far older, far more painful. Aurora was 4 when she saw her parents killed, too young to know grief. That came years later. Her strongest emotion was a sense of betrayal at the wanton destruction of the order and sanctity of her world. So her parents were killed in this plane crash. Her mother was a Kenyan princess, her father an American photojournalist. So we get these little kind of recountings and flashes of Storm's past. And so she really does feel empathy for Kitty here in terms of the way that she's losing her parents, at least them being together, and being sent off in effect to a boarding school where she doesn't know anyone. Aurora says to Kitty as they embrace, life is very lonely, Kitty. To live it well, you must be strong enough to trust, to risk, to forgive. Your parents do love you. And Kitty's tearful response is, I suppose I hurt Aurora. And Storm says to her, you're growing up. And so that's what readers are coming for and sticking around for, even as they age out of the action adventure type comic the X-Men is, like for 13, 14-year-olds ideally. But you could hang around, you could stick around in 1981 as a 17, 18-year-old for these kinds of elements of the storytelling and the characterization. This is a nice shot as well from Sherman. I like the look of Professor X's Rolls Royce there. These, what are they here? What are these animals? I think are they horses? Here at the entrance to the house. I like the way that Wolverine is sitting on this, what is it, like a veranda wall. And I like the way that Nightcrawler is balanced on it. So that's nice. And it's Monday morning, bright and early. Kitty's ready to leave. So the professor says, we can send your furniture after you or home to Deerfield in Illinois. And she says, no, keep it here. I intend to visit you guys every chance I get. So then we have Kitty bidding farewell with kisses to everyone. And a special moment between her and Colossus. Again, Sherman does very good here on the art. I like the details in the background. This water feature or fountain in the background. He's not scrimping on those details. We've got a kiss between Colossus and Kitty. We don't get Colossus's reaction to it. Instead, the story moves on. Cyclops offers to accompany Kitty and Storm to Massachusetts because he figures there could be some possible danger en route. But Storm says she thinks she can manage as she alights, and she has elected to drive Kitty all the way from upstate New York to Massachusetts. And they reach their destination, the city of Snow Valley, deep in Massachusetts' magnificent Berkshire Mountains, by mid-afternoon. So that's interesting. So that is the location, years later, obviously, of Generation X's, Generation X. That's where they're based as well, because they take over the Massachusetts Academy under the tutorship of Banshee and the White Queen, but years in the future. So they're like, Kitty's wondering here, after our last tussle with the Hellfire Club, I did a lot of research on the people we fought. Emma Frost owns most of the land around here and controls most of the local industries. She's filthy rich. They're all filthy rich. They don't need to be criminals. They do it for kicks. They're sick. She's talking about the Hellfire Club, the members of the Hellfire Club. And Storm says, I can't argue with that. What do you think of the academy? The grounds are beautiful. I like this. This is a good observation here. Kitty says the campus is perfect. The students are perfect. I hate it. I know the professor wanted me to dress nicely to make a good impression, but I wish I wore my oldest, most frayed, most comfortable pair of jeans. Everyone I see looks like a school, looks alike, a school of preppy zombie clones. Yuck. So Claremont really doing very well here to capture the voice of a 13-and-a-half-year-old girl like Kitty Pryde. Now we've got the switch over to Bob McLeod. So the art style changes. Sherman didn't manage to do too many of the pages of this issue. He's done about a third, and the rest of it is McLeod. Much prefer Sherman's art, to be honest. McLeod's is a little rougher in parts. Like here, this figure here, that's a very strange looking face. Or this is supposed to be Emma Frost here, and the rendering is very, very basic. But other aspects of the work is good, and the storytelling is good too. So what happens is Kitty is taken by one of the school administrators to her room, and meanwhile Storm is waiting in the lounge, and then suddenly she spies Emma Frost. Light flares, star bright in the room, and heads look upwards in confusion and alarm as a peal of thunder rumbles across the cloudless sky. But we don't learn yet what actually happened until a few pages later. Soon after that, Kitty's gotten all organized, and now it's time to say a proper and full goodbye to Storm. And Storm's last words to Kitty are, be brave, my dear one, and remember, should you ever need the X-Men or me as a friend, you have but to call. But something is not quite right with Storm, and that becomes clear as Kitty walks off to her dorm, that something is strange. So we get the thoughts here of quote-unquote Storm, where she's thinking to herself, I'm probably too close to the academy. Kitty might see what I'm doing, but I don't care. I've waited too long, planned and worked too hard for this moment. And in this, as in all things, my pleasure will not be denied. Now that does not sound like Storm at all, and why she lost her headdress as well. What is going on? So let's continue with the story and we shall find out. So she emerges from the Rolls Royce and conjures a storm, quoting Shakespeare, King Lear, blow winds and crack your cheeks. Rage, blow, you cataracts and hurricanes spout, till you've drenched our steeples, drowned the cocks. You sulphurous and thought-executing fires, vaunt couriers of oak-cleaving thunderbolts, singe my white head. That's a very appropriate verse, given Storm's white hair, and also King Lear's, who's 80 in the play. And Librarian Louise has the exact act and scene, Act 3, Scene 2. So nice little sequence here. And then we get Storm in the air, playing around with her powers, experimenting with every facet of her elemental powers, doing whatever she pleases, totally heedless of the consequences. When she learns all she thinks she needs to, she tries to send the storm away, only to discover, like the man who grabbed the tiger's tail, that such forces are more easily set in motion than restrained. She accepts the challenge, pitting her human will against the powers of nature gone wild. The struggle leaves her exhausted, but at its end, all is once more as it should be. And then she thinks to herself here, her costume is shredded, and she puts this shawl over her, white fur. What could that portend? She thinks, in these last few minutes, I nearly lost control. I must remember that I cannot create such effects out of nothing. I manipulate natural weather patterns at a fantastically accelerated rate that requires absolute precision, total concentration. If I ever let things get out of hand, the results could be devastating. For a time, I became one with the earth itself. And then she lights up a cigarette, completely not Storm. She makes a phone call here to the Hellfire Club. And who picks up except for Sebastian Shaw? And he says, and she says, good evening, Sebastian. This is Aurora. I've just delivered Kitty Pryde to the Massachusetts Academy, and I thought I'd ring an old friend. You don't mind? And he says, not at all. Judging from recent weather reports in your vicinity, I assume all is going to plan. So the reader here is perhaps thinking at this point that Storm has been a deep cover agent of the Hellfire Club. It's so bizarre what's going on. I think the artist here, and I think it is McLeod here still, is using some photo reference for these faces. It looks pretty good. So they have the end of the laughing phone call, and Storm, quote unquote, says, I'll be on the road a few hours more. Initiate phase 2 after my arrival at Xavier's school. See you then. And then we switch back to a sub-basement beneath the Academy's administration building. We've got these 2 security guards outside. There's a scream inside, and it looks like a blonde-haired figure is on the floor thinking, Goddess, what a nightmare. So now we're beginning to piece things together. There's been a mind swap. So that's what happened when Storm saw Emma Frost. Emma transferred her psyche into Storm's body, and Storm's psyche into Emma's body, and there it is revealed when she switches on the light in the room and sees the reflection in the mirror. So, that's something that Emma Frost will do again in the future. She'll do it in Uncanny X-Men 314 with Iceman's body when she emerges from a coma and she crosses psychically into his body. But this is the first time she does it. So it's a bizarre little trick of hers. Then we have a scene switch to upstate New York, to the grounds of Professor X's mansion. And we have Amanda Sefton here and Nightcrawler. They first met since childhood back in Uncanny X-Men 98, and they've been seeing each other romantically since then. So here they are having a passionate kiss by the lake, Breakstone Lake, and then they're interrupted. And this is a bit of a shock because they're interrupted by none other than the Sentinels. And we haven't seen the Sentinels since issue 100. So it's a surprise. Well, we haven't seen them in the present day. We saw them in Days of Future Past, of course, but those were more advanced models. So these are the conventional Sentinels. And so I like this moment too, where Nightcrawler is blasted there. He's knocked unconscious. Amanda's coming after him to his aid. And then just out of the X-Mansion, we have an optic blast. Full force, as Amanda thinks to herself. A force beam from the house. Must be Cyclops firing a full power optic blast. That's cool. That's really nicely done. And then we have the wake of the Sentinel falling in the lake. They're covered in water. Wolverine comes charging from the house as well. And he tells Amanda, head for the house. We're too vulnerable out here. I'll lug the elf. Move. He says, if you feel a slight tingle inside your skull, that'll be Charlie using his psi powers to keep track of us. When we're in range, he keeps a constant low-level rapport with all the X-Men. That's how he knew you two were under attack. But he asks her, what are you staring at? That robot Wolverine. Now, this is a great little cliffhanger page turn. Watch this. After the ads, of course. There we go. I really like that panel. It didn't come alone. So there's 3 of them. What are they, Wolverine? She asks, what do they want with us? So he explains they're Sentinels, mechanical mutant hunters, and more often than not, assassins as well. So, where are they coming from? This is the control room, and it's at the Hellfire Club. There we see Sebastian Shaw with Tessa at his side. She doesn't get any dialogue, but she's there nonetheless. And we have all these female operators of the Sentinels. And we get a little catch up there on Wolverine's adamantium skeleton and so on and so forth. And Shaw says, neutralize him, that's Wolverine, quickly. But keep him alive. Harry Leyland has plans for that pipsqueak psychopath because back in issue 133, Wolverine skewered Harry Leyland with his claws. So obviously he wants some revenge and payback against Wolverine. But Wolverine's adamantium claws, he's able to handle the cables shot out from the Sentinel's palms. He deals with those easily enough. Colossus arrives. That's a nice shot of Colossus there, pulling on those cables. And Wolverine instructs him, beautiful, he's all yours. I'll tackle his buddies. So the 2 guys go up against the Sentinel robots, but one of them blasts him with a blinding light. I really like that panel too. I think that's nicely done. And Colossus thinks here that blast caught Wolverine full in the face. His enhanced super sensitive eyesight must have made him especially vulnerable to its attack. I must protect him until he recovers. So Wolverine can't see, but he has other senses that he can rely on. So he says here aloud to Colossus, I may be blind, but my other senses are working fine. I don't need to see your ugly face to cut it to ribbons, capiche, sucker. So he's cutting away at this Sentinel, and meanwhile Cyclops is still blasting from the house. So my thinking is, why hasn't Cyclops left the house? Well, he's got cover there and he's trying to aid the others in getting back to the house where they will have some cover, but the cover is not going to be complete, as we see in the next panel here on the other page, because one of the Sentinels has ripped through the ceiling, the roof of the mansion. And just at that moment, and also uses a knockout gas on Professor X and Cyclops, so that takes them out of the fight. And just at that moment, up the driveway, the entrance to the X-Mansion grounds, we've got the Rolls Royce arriving and Storm / White Queen. And she sees the Sentinel up on the roof and she thinks to herself, Shaw, how typical of you to start without me. Do you hope that your precious toys can defeat the X-Men single-handedly, thereby rendering my plan to infiltrate them pointless? I wish you luck, my darling, because I think you'll need it. The X-Men have fought the Sentinels before and triumphed every time. That's a nice shot of Storm there, wearing the White Queen's cape. So we're back to the fight. Wolverine dodging one of the Sentinels' eye blasts there. One of the Sentinels getting the better of Colossus, smashing him into the earth. They're still trying to make it back to the house. Nightcrawler now teleports into the mansion to boxes of plastic explosive, grabs some detonators as well, and uses his powers in 9 seconds to attach plastic explosives to the legs of this trio of Sentinels out by the lake. And on the 10th second, they explode, so their legs are blasted away. That's a very nice sequence here. We continue. Again, this is a very good panel. The action being well balanced by McLeod in the art there. And what happens is that Storm arrives and she blasts one of the Sentinels from behind, but the Sentinel falls on Wolverine, knocking him out despite his adamantium laced skull. And Nightcrawler asks, why did you attack so carelessly, Storm? The robot was crippled. We could have found safer ways to destroy it. And Amanda says, Wolverine's hurt, unconscious, if he hadn't shielded me from the explosion. But Storm says, I'm sorry, Nightcrawler, I saw you in peril. I sought only to help. So she instructs Colossus to change to his human form and get into his civilian clothes just in case any neighbors come calling to investigate the sounds coming from the grounds of the X-Mansion. So everybody's caught unawares, and Storm/Emma Frost uses a low-yield lightning bolt to knock them all unconscious, and then says, you'll all be guests of the Hellfire Club for the rest of your natural lives. And then we switch back to the sub-basement of the Massachusetts Academy, where Storm is being held in the body of Emma Frost. She hasn't, of course, forgotten the skills she learned as a thief in Cairo, Egypt, when she was a child, and she uses them to pick the lock of the room that she's been imprisoned in. Meanwhile, the two guards have changed into their Hellfire Club mercenary gear. So we've got those face plates designed by John Byrne, very distinctive look. And they catch her on the ground because Storm is unable to deal with Emma's telepathic powers. So if Emma has in Storm's body access to Storm's elemental power, Storm in Emma's body has no experience of psychic powers and doesn't know how to shield herself from all the thoughts coming from all the people in the Massachusetts Academy. So the two guards try to grab her, but Storm runs on instinct. With speed born of desperation, she races into the night, fleeing the hundreds of minds whose thoughts and feelings crowd her own. She's drowning, losing touch with her unique, essential self. Reality blurs, twists, reforms as Aurora seeks salvation in her memories. She flashes back to a long ago evening in the Greenwich Village apartment of her dearest friend, Jean Grey. So we didn't really see too much of the personal friendship between Storm and Phoenix or Jean Grey in the run to this point, but Claremont starts to retcon that close friendship between them. Here he's doing it again, but he'll do it even more so in the backup stories to classic X-Men some years down the road. And then we're on the last page, and this is interesting. So she remembers a moment that she was visiting Jean in her Greenwich apartment. Jean, will you at least let me ask for things before you telekinetically toss them at me? And Jean responded, didn't you ask? I'm sorry, Aurora. It takes a ferocious amount of concentration to keep my telepathic ability in line. Sometimes, if I'm not careful, I get people's thoughts and words confused. So that's the clue that Storm needs in order to get a rudimentary control over this psychic sensitivity she now experiences with Emma's mutant powers. So she thinks to herself, concentration is the key. I must maintain a wall around my mind to block out everyone else's thoughts. I'm used to focusing my will when I control the weather. The process is similar and it's beginning to work. So now she's getting a handle on those powers, and she decides to visit Kitty in the dorm room. Kitty's there just waiting for trouble. She's very doubtful about Emma Frost's bona fides, and it seems confirmed when none other than Emma Frost bursts into her bedroom. And the thought flashes in her mind, I've heard of giving a girl what she wants, but this is ridiculous. Kitty dives off the bed, meaning to phase through the floor and escape. And Storm reaches out towards her. Child, don't stop. But what happens is there's an involuntary, subconscious psybolt unleashed that knocks Kitty out. And Storm cradles Kitty in her arms and thinks and says aloud, I came to save this child I love, and instead I may have killed her. So that's our cliffhanger for the end of the issue. Of course, she hasn't killed Kitty Pryde. But there you go. So as I said, at the beginning of this video, I feel that Claremont is feeling, whether he would admit it or not at the time, the loss of that additional partnership with on the stories from John Byrne, the two of them working together. The whole was greater than the parts. And we're seeing that here, where there's a kind of a casting around, as I said earlier, for some kind of arc, some kind of plot. We're going to get it coming up shortly when Cockrum returns. We'll get it in the form of the X-Men going into space and the Brood saga. But just at this point, he's still casting around for something, and it feels like he's treading water a little bit. But the heart of it all is these emotional relationships between the characters, and in this two-parter, the emotional relationship between Storm and Kitty Pryde. So we've got a letters page there, a few letters there, a bit of a weird one here from a 14-year-old girl who's suggesting that the creators have a story arc with Kitty getting hooked on drugs so that readers could learn about how drugs are bad. Pretty weird stuff. And that is it. I do hope that you enjoyed this review and commentary on Uncanny X-Men 151. If you did, please like the video on YouTube. It really helps the channel. And if you haven't done so already, subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for more content like this.